As the New Orleans Saints continue their endeavor of trying to retool their offensive line, adding a veteran wide receiver might be one of the most important moves this offseason as well. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Ooh, what is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, the New Orleans Saints are finding some savvy ways to make themselves some money while retaining player talent. We'll go through some of the bigger salary cap moves the Saints have made this offseason. We'll take a look at more offensive line options on the market with Mekhi Becton now heading to Los Angeles. And we're going to kick everything off with the reasons why a veteran wide receiver could be very helpful for the New Orleans Saints offense. We got all that and much more for you on today's episode. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where you can get $200 in bonus bets by winning your first $5 bet. Just head over to FanDuel.com today to get started. We know that the offensive line and the trenches for the New Orleans Saints are the places where the Saints can make the biggest strides this offseason. Some of the most important moves they'll make this offseason will happen in those areas. But another very important and maybe even a little underrated of a move that they could make this offseason as well comes down to adding a veteran wide receiver to their otherwise very young wide receiver room. And I think that could end up being one of the more impactful moves that the Saints make this offseason should they go that route. And there are options that will allow them to do that. The New Orleans Saints have a young wide receiver room. Their oldest and most experienced talent come down to guys like Cedric Wilson Jr., who has 7 years in the NFL, and then Dante Pettis, who has 6 years in the NFL. And both of those guys weren't necessarily heavy contributors for the New Orleans Saints in 2024, and expecting them to be veteran leaders here in 2025 is kind of a tall ask for what their roles actually are. Dante Pettis wasn't signed until midway through the 2024 season, and Cedric Wilson had 20 catches last year, just over 100 receiving yards, and barely saw the field as the team's third wide receiver option because of the heavy usage of 2 tight end sets, 2 running back sets, things like that we expect the New Orleans Saints will likely continue under Kellen Moore here in 2025. And so going out there and getting an established veteran top tier or even former top tier level receiver, I think is a really important task for the New Orleans Saints that we haven't really discussed very much for this offseason. And we've seen already this offseason that the Saints themselves were apparently interested in this same pursuit, as well as they were apparently in on Cooper Kupp before the former Los Angeles Rams wide receiver signed with the Seattle Seahawks. That was a move much like the Davante Adams move that I advocated for when it came to the Saints, because you're not risking your ability to get younger by signing an aging free agent. You're not giving up draft value like you would if you were trading for one of those guys. And I never thought that trading for Cooper Kupp was going to be a move that the Saints were either interested in or that would be worth their time in the first place, because you don't want to give up that draft capital in order to get somebody at a that's can come in and help be a veteran leader, all these other things. Now, Cooper Kupp went to the Seattle Seahawks on a $15 million per year deal, which is way more than the Saints need to invest out in a veteran wide receiver, and way more than I thought anyone would invest in Cooper Kupp, who's not been able to play more than 11, 12 games a season for several years now, ever since being that offensive player of the year back in 2020, 2021. I mean, he just hasn't been the same guy. And so $15 million per year, yeah, I'd stay away from that too. But there are other and more affordable options on the market that the Saints should be interested in, and some of which have some familiarity with their coaching staff already. I'll start with one name that played for the Chicago Bears last year in veteran wide receiver Keenan Allen, who's going to be 33 years old by the time that the season starts. But again, you don't go to free agency to get younger, you go to free agency to get better if you can, right? And to fill some holes. And so the reason why I think Keenan Allen could be an option for New Orleans is because of the overlap between Keenan Allen and Kellen Moore over in their year together in 2023 with the Los Angeles Chargers. He's coming in now. Look, Pro Football Focus has his deal set at 2 years, $12.5 million per year. I don't think you're going to get that on the market. And if you do, pass, right? Like if that's what this is going to be, to get this veteran wide receiver that is basically somebody to be there to kind of help you mentor your young wide receivers in the room. You've got your top two guys in Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed. You can go to the draft and get a third top guy. But if you're signing one of these guys in free agency, you're not expecting to be one of your top three wideouts, or certainly not one of your top two wideouts. And so I'm not paying more than $10 million per year for a wide receiver. If there's anything out there and these guys are demanding or commanding more than that on the market, then let them go and get that somewhere else in the market. I'm talking about a good, manageable situation here. And last year, Keenan Allen, 74 receptions, 744 receiving yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns, all would have been at the top of the wide receiver room for the New Orleans Saints last year. He appeared in 15 games, which is more than any top wide receiver appeared in games in 2024 for the Saints as well. You look back at 2023 with Keenan Allen under Kellen Moore, just 13 games, but caught 108 passes for over 1,200 yards, as well as 7 touchdowns. But he wouldn't need to do that here. I mean, he wouldn't have to catch 70 passes here. The idea is to come here and catch maybe 50 and be able to contribute a little bit, while mostly being a guy that can help your young players in your otherwise very young wide receiver room develop. That's got to be the focus in terms of a free agency signing like this. So Keenan Allen would definitely be one that I would watch out for, though he might want a bigger role than what he would have here in New Orleans. Another name to watch out for that, again, has some familiarity with with Kellen Moore is Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper and Kellen Moore overlapped in Dallas. Amari Cooper, 30 years old, 31 likely by the time that the season starts, I believe. And again, somebody that can come in and be that big-bodied, quick pass receiver to help move the ball down the field, all those other things. Started 2024 in Cleveland, ended up being traded to the Buffalo Bills. There was conversation around the Saints potentially being interested in him as a player while he was being kind of put on that trade market. And he put up the stats that I think you'd be looking for from a wide receiver here in 2025 to couple with, or to partner with, your couple of top young wide receivers, and potentially another name that you could add in the draft, like a Teteroa McMillan or a Jaden Higgins or something like that. 44 receptions, 547 yards, 4 touchdowns. That's really all that you're looking for from one of these types of players in terms of what their major role would be. But look, he was somebody that overlapped with Kellen Moore during the 2019 to 2021 era with the Dallas Cowboys before he ended up heading over to Cleveland. And so maybe there's some familiarity there, some comfort there that could end up attracting him here to New Orleans to be a little bit more of a role player. Again, Pro Football Focus, 2 years, $15 million. You're not getting that when Cooper Kupp just got $15 million. I'm sorry. And so, you got to come here being willing to hold a different kind of role. And because of that, your paycheck is going to be impacted by it. But I do think that adding a veteran wide receiver for New Orleans could be a move that makes a lot of sense for this team. You just have to be careful not to overpay on it. There'd be no reason to overpay for these types of things. There's also Elijah Moore out there, 1 year, $4.5 million is his projection. Brandon Cooks, 1 year, $3 million is his projection. Noah Brown, 1 year, $2.4 million is his projection. Those are the types of moves that you're really looking at. So if you can get one of those other names, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper, and get something a little bit closer to, not exactly $4.5 million, but something that's closer to that, 1 year, $6 million, and then, prorated a little while and all those other things, then I think that those are the types of signings that could potentially not just make sense for New Orleans, but would be worth the expense to give that team the veteran leadership that it needs to help to build up those young wide receivers, a group that could grow over the course of this offseason. Coming up next, New Orleans Saints miss out on a top offensive lineman, but don't worry, there's still options out there that could be plug-and-play starters at left guard. Let's break them down, leading off with one big name, Tevin Jenkins, up next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And with March Madness being here, FanDuel is going all out to give you everything that you need to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets by winning your first $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets that you can use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, even to who's cutting down the net. There's so much for you to check out, including live betting, one of my favorite things that FanDuel offers. Miss tip-off, no worries. You can still get in on those fourth quarter comebacks, scoring leaders by quarter, a ton of stuff for you to check out over at FanDuel. I always recommend, as a first-time customer, put your first $5 down on a money line of a heavy favorite. The Denver Nuggets, 12-point favorites up against the Washington Wizards. Really good bet to get in on. For your first $5 bet, you win that, you can get $200 in bonus bets today. Visit FanDuel.com to get started and get in on all the college hoops action all tournament long. All right, family, the New Orleans Saints were not the team to sign Mekhi Becton to help out their offensive line. However, there are still some potential plug-and-play starters out there the Saints can find in this year's free agency. I want to start off with the team missing out on Mekhi Becton. We don't know at this moment if the Saints were even interested in Mekhi Becton. He was kind of my number one guy because of the connection between he and Kellen Moore. It seemed very simple. It seemed like a logical fit. However, Mekhi Becton signs a 2-year, $20 million deal with the Los Angeles Chargers. We don't know if that's an outbid in terms of more than what the Saints were willing to pay. We don't know if the Saints even got involved or anything like that. But it's clear, though, no matter what, that left guard has no starter, right? You could say maybe Will Clapp is going to end up plugging in there, but I don't think that that's what the contract value tells you. You could say that maybe Nick Saldiveri goes in there, but I don't think that you can trust that that will happen, and you have to be ready just in case. Remember, that was supposed to be the plan last year. And really, Lucas Patrick, who ended up starting at left guard at the beginning of the season, he ended up being a guy that they brought in on a 1-year deal that was effectively going to be the backup center, backup interior offensive line guy, kind of like what Will Clapp just got brought in to do here in 2025, actually. And then he turned into the starter. So who knows? Maybe Will Clapp will turn into the starter. But if that ends up being the case, it will be a surprise because that doesn't feel like that was the intent of the signings. The Saints right now still have a big hole open on their offensive line, and it is a spot that they intend to address. We just need to see if they're able to get a starter in free agency or if they're going to have to wait into the draft. And the tricky part about waiting into the draft is that there's good talent there. Nobody that I would take at 9 on your offensive line. But there's good talent at 40. There's good talent at 71 or 93, 2 of the other picks they have in the 3rd round. There's good talent in day 3 when it comes to potential starters on the offensive line. USC center John Monheim is a guy that could play interior as a whole, and somebody that I would be perfectly comfortable rolling the dice with in the day 3 as a potential starter. Fine with that. But that might not be the route that the Saints want to go because there's no guarantees in the draft, right? The only way that you can guarantee is if you trade up, but that doesn't always, teams don't always pick up, teams don't always say yes, teams don't always allow you to trade up. So it's not as controllable as free agency can be. And so I would expect the Saints to try to address this in free agency. If they don't, then either something's gone awry or it's just a big time miss by New Orleans. Like if they don't sign a potential starting offensive lineman, that to me is something that the Saints will have done wrong in free agency. Something didn't go the way that it was supposed to go. But that hasn't happened just yet. There are still options out there for the New Orleans Saints. So I do want to dive into some of those options. The first of which that I want to highlight is Chicago Bears offensive lineman Tevin Jenkins. So Tevin Jenkins is just 27 years old. He's athletic. He's got guard tackle versatility, played a ton of right tackle during his time over at OSU, Oklahoma State University. Played at the right side, but also went over and took some snaps over on the left when needed to as well. He was actually ranked more highly at number 29 than Mekhi Becton, who was ranked at number 42 on Pro Football Focus's top free agent list. But I actually think that he ends up probably getting less money than Mekhi Becton got. Mekhi Becton, just 25 years old, has shown a little bit more of a propensity for health than Tevin Jenkins has. Tevin Jenkins does have a bit of an injury history that is worth being concerned about. However, last year he appeared in 14 games, played over 700 snaps, allowed just 17 pressures, did allow 4 sacks, and committed 4 penalties. But as a whole, both as a pass blocker and as a run blocker, was very effective for that team. A lot of the sacks that Caleb Williams took last year were on Caleb Williams as well. And so I think that kind of shades a little bit of the conversation around the Chicago Bears free agent offensive lineman, because it's not just Tevin Jenkins, but another guy that could make sense would be Matt Pryor. 24 pressures allowed, 7 sacks surrendered, and 7 penalties committed. But again, very strong pass blocker throughout his career. But with that Caleb Williams, gameplay and everything like that and play style, I think that was a little bit more of a challenge for this offensive line than initially expected over in Chicago. That's not the type of ball that the New Orleans Saints will be playing here in 2025. So both of those guys could be solid options for New Orleans. Tevin Jenkins being the one that I think should sit at the top of the list at this point. However, he's visiting the Seattle Seahawks on Monday on a free agent visit. So unless you're going to get him here to New Orleans right after that, or even sneak in before that, you got to be ready with other options. So we got you covered. I got 2 other options for you, one of which should sound familiar. Offensive lineman Dalton Risner. If that name sounds familiar, it's because we talked about him a ton last offseason as well as a guy that was a natural fit in then offensive coordinator Clint Kubiak's offense. The two overlapped together in Minnesota the year before, or a couple years before, and Risner is a guy that has been around a bunch in some of those Kubiak systems, spending time in Denver, spending time in Minnesota, so on and so forth. Somebody that I think could potentially end up, because of how many schemes he's played in, how many coaches he's played under, how many different offensive lines he's worked his way to being a starter as a part of, shows you just how good this guy is. And I think his scheme versatility is something that ends up making you feel like, you know what, even though he hasn't played in Kellen Moore's system yet, you know that Kellen Moore's system is all about doing things that the players do well, not just doing what it is that Kellen Moore wants to do. And so when you get a guy like Dalton Risner who has that scheme versatility, he could be a pretty good fit for you. 21 pressures allowed last season, only 1 sack, 0 penalties committed, a very clean player. He's somebody that excels as a pass blocker, but maybe has seen a little bit of a step back as a run blocker. So you'd like to see him be able to maybe get a little bit stronger there. But if the Saints are able to coach that out of him, and you're able to get that out of him with Brendan Nugent and Kellen Moore and TJ Paginetti and all these guys that really want to focus on the run game, that I think you can get a really good start from a guy like Dalton Risner, who comes in, plugs in for a year, and then potentially hits the market again looking for his next position, or next situation. Meanwhile, the New Orleans Saints are either moving on into 2026 with fresh look at free agency, maybe moving on in 2026 with somebody they drafted late in 2025, or going into the draft in 2026, knowing that that's a position that they need to address. The last thing that I'll mention here is Arizona Cardinals offensive lineman Will Hernandez. Now, Hernandez is a little interesting, okay? Last time that you have to find a full season for him, you got to go back to 2023, because last year in 2024, he ended up having a knee injury that ended his season just 5 games into the year. There's pluses and minuses to that. The plus is a business plus, right? No injury is a plus. I want to be very clear about that. But the plus from a business side is that he's probably not going to be a guy that's going to be there's not going to be a lot of cost deterrent around a guy like Will Hernandez coming off of a knee injury. But if he checks out medically and looks good, the last time in 2023, when he had a nice season playing over 1,000 snaps, 29 pressures allowed, 4 sacks, 1 penalty committed, very good against the pass, very good as a run blocker as well. So another name to potentially keep an eye out for, a guy that was outstanding and played left tackle, right tackle, left guard, right guard with the New York Giants, as well as the Arizona Cardinals, kind of bounced around, has a lot of experience at a bunch of different offensive line positions. I think there's value there in a player like Will Hernandez. Even if you don't sign him to be a starter, if you sign him to add to your depth, you'd feel pretty good about it. I'll actually mention one more name, Brandon Scherff from over with the Jacksonville Jaguars most immediately. Had a 3-year deal with the Jacksonville Jaguars, started and played every single game during that tenure. So yeah, he might be 30-something years old. But again, you're not trying to get younger when you're signing in free agency. You're trying to win games. And a guy like Brandon Scherff, who allowed 0 sacks last year, committed only 2 penalties and only allowed 17 pressures in total, could be somebody that comes in and again is a stopgap for you for a year before you turn things over to a younger option in 2026. Coming up next, I want to take a look at the New Orleans Saints salary cap. We'll update where they are, and we'll take a look at a couple of moves that, even though it saved them talent, brought them talent, it actually ended up saving them money. Let's get to that next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at Monarch Money. I like to think of Monarch Money as my own personal CFO in my pocket, right? It's this app and program that allows you to be able to really track what it is that you're doing. You ever check your bank account one day and you're like, where did all my money go? Hey, look, it's happened to everybody. but Monarch Money comes in and helps you be able to get full visibility and control over your finances, whether you're looking at investments, watching your accounts. Maybe you've got goals and plans in terms of what it is that you're wanting to look at for your future. All of that is available for you in one place. So stop just managing your money and start building wealth with Monarch Money today. Monarch Money is one of my favorite apps that I've had in a long time because all in one place, not a bunch of different apps to like track everything, your future spending, your future goals, all this other stuff. One app, everything you need over at Monarch Money. Take control of your finances today with Monarch Money. Use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com to get 50% off of your first year. That's monarchmoney.com. And that is code LOCKEDONNFL for 50% off your first year. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints have done an awful lot of run-it-backness on their roster this offseason, which is a bit of a surprise considering how much change has happened over on the coaching staff. An almost entirely new coaching staff with the exception of a few guys that made it through, like Keith Williams and an assistants on the offensive and defensive sides. But for the most part, like this is an entirely new leadership group. But it's kind of the same roster with a couple of exceptions. Justin Reed, Devon Godshaw, for instance. But even the other guys have all been guys that have been here before. Isaac Yadam and Will Clapp and stuff like that. But I think that the Saints are doing this because this is going to be what we've said for a long time is that this is going to be a multi-year rebuild, retool process. And this is this year's portion of the rebuild, retool process. And look, a solid draft class would help. And the Saints got a 9th draft selection. Originally, when the NFL did their compensatory pick formula calculations and stuff like that, the Saints did not get a 7th round pick for Isaac Yadam's departure last year because it was canceled out by Cedric Wilson Jr. They went back to the drawing board on that, recalculated. The Saints got their 7th round draft pick. So they've got 9 picks. If they can get 3 solid players out of that, then all of a sudden, like this Saints team could look very different depending upon where those solid players are and what the definition of solid is, right? Are they starters? Are they rotational? Are they impact? Are they superstars? Are they stars? Like whatever it might be. But in any case, like hitting on a third of that draft class would help the Saints quite a bit, especially if they get some other depth options and special teams options out of the rest of it as well. But if the Saints can do that, then they're in a better situation than they look like they're in right now. I can't say that I feel like this roster has gotten better from 2024 to 2025, but they're not done yet either. So I don't really want to have that conversation in full until later. But I do want to explain why I think that the Saints are playing this sort of run it back kind of record at the moment. And the reason why those songs are playing is because keeping players in the building right now is opening up money for them to be able to spend. The issue is that they're not spending it. And I don't know why. But maybe we'll find out. The Saints could have as much as $25 million available to them right now. They sit currently with $18 million according to Over the Cap, but that's before any kind of Cam Jordan pay cut is factored in, which we do believe that the Saints were likely to approach him about a pay cut, and that may have been the thing upon which year 15 was contingent upon for Cam Jordan. Cam Jordan returning for his 15th year. It's likely that the Saints went after him for a pay cut. If they did, and he took it, that would explain why he knew that he was getting year 15 here in New Orleans. I expect about a $6 million saving in that situation just based on percentage of snaps last year, role going into 2025, all those other pieces. So with that being the case, and then what we also understand is that the trade acquisition of Devon Godshaw inherited for the Saints, got something in my eye, inherited in the Saints about a $4 million base salary here, or actually exactly a $4 million base salary here in 2025. Could the Saints look to adjust that as well? So if you were to restructure that, you're probably saving around $1 million, $1.5 million, call it 1.3, 1.4. So it could open up the Saints for another $1.5 million on top of that $6 million. So about $7.5 million that the Saints could potentially save from that. So the Saints are sitting somewhere between 18 and let's call it $24 million just to be conservative. There's spending money available. And the reason why the Saints have been re-signing some of the talent that they have in the building is probably to open up some of that salary cap savings. For instance, the idea of retaining Chase Young. Chase Young would have cost them $9 million of dead cap had he walked out the door. The Saints structured that contract in such a way that he only counts a little bit over $6 million over the salary cap, saving the Saints around $2 million or so. Right now, on over the cap, he's credited with taking up about $4.5 million. It's going to really come out to be like 6.2, 6.3. So the Saints are going to, or 6.2, 6.3, somewhere around there. And so Saints are going to save somewhere around $2.5 million. And then, take that or leave that in terms of with the calculations of what Cam Jordan's deal turns into and all these other things. So again, somewhere between 18 to $22 million. Now, you add on top of that the Juwan Johnson deal, for instance. Juwan Johnson is extended 3 years, $30 million. And so with all of that, there's a chance, or not a chance, but with the way that contract is structured, he goes from counting $6.5 million against the salary cap to about $5.4 million against the salary cap. Not a huge amount of savings, but again, $1 million in savings as opposed to $6 million in expense. And they get the player as opposed to don't have the player. So I get why the Saints were doing this, because it's actually the more financially responsible decision to actually re-sign these players as opposed to let them hit the market. Now, I've had some questions about whether or not the Saints ended up missing out on players because of re-signing players like Juwan Johnson and Chase Young. And it's a perfectly logical question, right? You see money being spent in one area, you see money not be spent in another area. And so the logical connection is, oh, well, that must mean that they spent that money over here instead of spending that money over there. But that's not necessarily the case. What oftentimes happens is that with these deals, it's just two sides to the conversation. Maybe the Saints and Mekhi Becton did go down the road with one another and did potentially talk about a contract. Well, if Mekhi Becton wants to go to Los Angeles, then he's not going to come to New Orleans. Like, as a city, if he decides that he wants to be on the West Coast, you're not going to pick up and relocate the organization so you can sign Mekhi Becton, right? If he decides that he wants to play in the AFC because of the challenge or because there's a lesser challenge or he doesn't want to play against his former team or whatever it might be, you can't realign the NFL to go and give that player what it is they want. So sometimes some things that players want when they're looking at making their choice in free agency, it's not a team's choice, it's the player's choice in free agency. There's just some things you can't do for them. And so in a situation where the Saints spent a little bit of money and actually didn't even spend money to re-sign Juwan Johnson here in 2025, they saved money. They were actually in a better position to sign Mekhi Becton financially than they were had they let Juwan Johnson walk out of the building and lost money as opposed to gaining money. So no, those two things aren't connected. Now you might say, well, what about 2026, 2025? Perfectly acceptable question as well. But here's the thing. The Saints have about $18 million of 2026 salary cap left to spend, over $160 million in 2027. I don't think that a $10 million per year average deal that would have been included a signing bonus that would have been prorated over the course of 5 years and all these other things would have hindered the New Orleans Saints from doing that. This is the team that starts almost every league year staring down the barrel of tens of millions of dollars of overages. I don't think that they would have been upset with shaving off a little bit of their $18 million surplus in 2026 in order to be able to sign both Juwan Johnson to an extension and bring in Mekhi Becton. So I don't think that the two are connected in that way. I understand the thought process, of course, but the two aren't super connected. And then the other thing that I hear a lot of too, sometimes that I get questions about, so I'm trying to answer these questions in case you're curious about them too, is, well, the Saints were in on Cooper Kupp. Did that distract them from being in on Mekhi Becton? No, you're typically holding multiple of these conversations all the time and everything like that. So those two things wouldn't have had a real impact on it. But you can see why the Saints are kind of doing the run it back thing, which is an okay thing to be upset with, by the way. Like if you expected or disappointed with, if you expected the Saints to make more changes on their roster, they have not done that. And right now, up to this point, as I record on the 15th of March, they haven't shown the reason for stockpiling this cash and going that way and being fiscally more responsible and all these other things. You can get why you would be more fiscally responsible, but until they spend that money, it's hard to turn around and say, oh, well, now I get why they did that because they were looking to do this. As of right now, we're just waiting to see what it is that they're going to do. But I wouldn't start drawing conclusions where there's no connection. If the idea is to be upset because they brought players back, then be upset because they brought players back. That's reason enough. What they do with the money next, though, is the big thing. And again, if they open up all this money and they don't address their offensive line, very worth being confused about, very worth being upset about as a fan, I would say. That's certainly one that I would raise an eyebrow over, without a doubt, as I mentioned earlier in today's show. All right, coming up in tomorrow's episode, I want to dive more into the Derek Carr trade conversation. If the New Orleans Saints were going to trade Derek Carr, they should have done it already. But the time might be past, and it might be too late, even if Derek Carr does indeed want out of New Orleans. I'll tell you why in tomorrow's episode. We appreciate you very much. As always, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. If you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.